Chapter 11. Chance. The ride to Merribeth's house was odd to say the least. She sat in the front seat next to him, silent, her lips folded into a tight line, while her son sat in the back seat, firing off a barrage of questions at Chance. "What is your name?" "Chance Overstreet." He glanced over at Merribeth, unsure if talking to her son was allowed. She had made it clear that she didn't really want help from him, but it seemed rude to ignore the boy. This was definitely unclear territory. "How do you know my mom?" Chance paused to see if Merribeth would answer. He had no idea how much he was supposed to share, but her face remained passive. Well, I used to know your mom in high school, and now I'm her boss." "You knew her in high school?" His voice was incredulous. "You must be really old." A chuckle burst out of Chance's mouth before he could stop it. "I'm not that much older than your mom." "So you work at the resort like she does?" It was rather dizzying trying to keep up with the boy's train of thought, and Chance wondered how Merribeth did it every day. Perhaps it got easier when you were around the child every day? "That's right. I recently got hired to manage the resort." "What does it mean to manage?" It meant a lot of things, but how did he explain that to a child? "It means that I'm in charge of hiring people and making sure they do their jobs correctly." "That sounds important." Chance nodded. It was important, but not as important as apologizing to the woman next to him, he realized. He didn't know what it would take, but he knew that he would have to do something. From the day she came back into his life, he'd felt that gaining her forgiveness needed to be his number one goal. He just wasn't sure how to go about doing that. Lucas continued to fire off questions until Chance pulled up in front of a modest brick house. Though nothing grand, the place was well maintained. The lawn, white with frost now, was trimmed and even, and a swing hung from the branch of a large tree in the yard. "Thank you for the ride." Merribeth unbuckled her seatbelt before the car even came to a complete stop. "I can help you in." Chance threw the car in park and reached for the keys to turn off the ignition. "No need. We can make it in ourselves." Chance hesitated. His military training insisted that he accompany her to the door. It was rude not to. But he also didn't want to make her uncomfortable. Perhaps he could meet her halfway. If he got out of the car and waited until she entered the house, he could be true to himself and not infringe too much on her wishes. Having decided that was the best course of action, he pushed his door open and stood, about the same time she appeared to get Lucas from his seat behind Chance. They nearly collided, her face reddening as she took a step back from him. "I told you walking me in was unnecessary." She shot him a pointed look as she extracted Lucas from the car. "I'm not walking you in, but remaining in the car feels rude to me. So, if you don't mind, I will stand and wait until you make it inside." "If that's what you feel you need to do." She adjusted Lucas's hat, though it hadn't been askew, before meeting his eyes again. "What time will you be by in the morning? I will need time to drop Lucas off as well." 7:30? As long as your daycare provider is close, that should give us plenty of time." She issued a curt nod. "That should be fine. We'll be ready." As Chance watched her walk inside, he leaned against the side of the car and wondered how he was going to break through her wall. He certainly didn't blame her for constructing it, but he was determined to show her he'd changed, especially after the talk with his mother earlier. Not only was he no longer the scared teen who'd left town and her nearly a decade ago, but he was coming to grips with the fact that his father's leaving hadn't been his fault. That revelation meant he was capable of love, and his time in the military and the death and destruction he had seen had shown him how important it was. Now he wanted it more than ever. Merribeth paused at the front door and flashed him a small wave before stepping inside and shutting the door. It wasn't much, but it was something, and he could work with something. Smiling to himself, he climbed back in the car and headed to his house. The small house didn't feel exactly like home yet, as boxes still littered the floors, even though he had spent the weekend unpacking, and the house was still devoid of character, something he hoped to fix before Christmas came. Christmas hadn't been his favorite season in a long time, but he had hope that this year it might be different. Suddenly, a loud explosion filled the air. Though Chance knew it was just the sound of a car backfiring, he could not help being transported back to the desert. The smell of smoke filled his nostrils, and he crumpled to the floor, hands clasping his head. His ears rang as pain echoed through his head. "Chance, come on. You have to help me some." Chance opened his eyes to see Israel leaning close to him. "Is?" "Yeah, it's me. We have to hurry. Can you move your legs?" Chance blinked to try and rein in his focus. Blood dripped from a cut above Israel's eye, and black smudges covered his face. "I think so." But as he put pressure on his leg, a searing pain shot through his thigh. Suddenly, the smoke faded, and the ringing in his ears stilled. The pain in his thigh, however, continued to throb, and as he opened his eyes, Chance realized he had collapsed to the floor and fallen on his injured leg. He rubbed a hand down the sore muscle, realizing he would have to see his therapist again soon. And then he remembered that he hadn't found a therapist here in Courage yet. He'd been hoping he wouldn't need to, but that had obviously been wishful thinking. He would have to add that to his ever-growing list. He blew out a frustrated breath and lifted his face to the ceiling. Prayer hadn't been at the top of his list or the front of his mind for a while now, and definitely not since the accident. Losing his friends and being discharged from the military had been his excuse for why, but in all honesty, he had merely been going through the motions for longer than he cared to admit. "Lord, I've messed things up pretty good trying to do things on my own. I could use some of your help and guidance. Help me find a way to make amends with Merribeth, and help me to focus on the future instead of living in the past. Also, help me to forgive my father." Though there was no audible answer, a sense of a weight being lifted from Chance's shoulders filled him, and he exhaled in relief. He could do this. It might not have been the life he planned for himself, and it might be a lot harder than he would have wished for, but he could do it. When the pain in his legs subsided, he stood and made his way over to his desk. Before he turned in for the night, there was one more thing he had to do, something he'd been avoiding for way too long. He lifted the lid of the laptop and opened his email. As the blinking cursor stared at him, he tried to think of the words he could say to the friend who had saved his life and who he had abandoned the last few months. Though definitely not enough, "I'm sorry" seemed like the perfect place to start. "Hey, Israel. I'm sorry it's been so long since I've written. The transition back to civilian life was much harder than I thought it would be, as was returning to my hometown. I'm working, though, managing a resort, if you can believe that. I know you still have some time to finish out your tour, but it would be good to see you when you get back in the States. I'll hook you up with a stay on the house." Chance paused and glanced back over the words. They didn't say everything he was feeling. He owed the man his life, after all. But he hoped Israel would be able to read the meaning between the lines. "Stay safe, brother. I wish I were still there with you. Chance." His finger paused just a moment before clicking on the send button. Once he sent it, there was no getting it back. But just like Merribeth, he owed Israel more than just an apology. With the email sent, he closed the laptop and made his way toward his bedroom. Today had been challenging, but tomorrow offered new opportunities, and that was something to look forward to.